What if the Bible hides a story so strange, so unsettling, that most people rush past it in only 4 verses? A story of beings who were never supposed to exist. A bloodline born in the shadow between heaven and earth. A name whispered through scripture like an echo from a world God chose to bury. The Nephilim. Were they giants? Fallen ones? Ancient tyrants? Or evidence that something happened before the flood, something humanity was never meant to forget? And if they were real, what happened to them? Before Noah built the ark, before the rain split the sky, the earth was already trembling under a different kind of judgment. This was the first world. A world still young, but already rotting from the inside. Humanity had multiplied. Cities had begun to rise from dust. Altars burned. Kingdoms formed. Violence spread like fire through dry grass. And in the middle of that growing darkness, Genesis gives us one of the most haunting lines in all of Scripture. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. Then everything changes. No long explanation. No comforting footnote. Just a doorway, opened for one moment, into a mystery that feels almost forbidden to look at. And then the text says it. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Not as a legend. Not as a myth whispered around a campfire. But placed there, right before the flood, like a warning. What most people don't realize, is that the Bible never pauses to satisfy your curiosity. It gives you just enough to disturb you. Just enough to make you lean forward. And just enough to ask the question that will drive this entire story. Who were the Nephilim, and why does Scripture mention them right before God decides to wash the world away? Start with the name itself. Nephilim. A word wrapped in uncertainty. Some connect it to the idea of the fallen ones. Others translate it simply as giants. And that ambiguity matters, because from the very beginning, the Nephilim are presented not as something clear, but as something half-seen. That's the first twist. The Bible introduces one of its strangest groups, and never fully defines them. Why? Maybe because the original audience already trembled at the name. Maybe because the mystery was part of the message. Or maybe because the point was never just what they were, but what they represented. Something had entered human history that did not belong there. And if their name means fallen, then fallen from where? From heaven? From righteousness? From the order God intended? But what happened next makes the mystery even darker. Genesis says the sons of God took the daughters of men, and children were born. That single line has sparked centuries of fear, debate, and fascination. One ancient interpretation says these sons of God were heavenly beings, watchers, rebels, divine beings crossing a boundary God never meant to be crossed. That view would make the Nephilim the offspring of a union between the supernatural and the human. And if that sounds extreme, remember, Genesis itself places this event right beside the collapse of the world. But there's another view. Some say the sons of God were not angels at all, but the righteous line of Seth, intermingling with the corrupt line of Cain. In that reading, the Nephilim are not monstrous hybrids, but violent men, tyrants, warrior kings, men of renown whose power became their corruption. Now here's the twist. Either way, whether supernatural or human, the result is the same. The world becomes filled with violence. Filled with pride. Filled with a kind of power cut loose from God. So maybe the deeper point is not just biology. Maybe it is rebellion embodied. What most people don't realize, is that the Nephilim may not just be characters in the story. They may be a symptom of something much bigger. Genesis calls them the mighty men of old, the men of renown. That sounds almost heroic, until you remember where the sentence is placed. Right before the flood. Right before God declares the thoughts of human hearts to be only evil continually. Right before judgment. So these were not heroes in the way we think of heroes. They were famous, powerful, celebrated. But fame in Scripture is not always a compliment. Sometimes the most admired men in an age are the very ones dragging it toward destruction. And suddenly the Nephilim start to feel less distant. Not just giants with impossible strength, but symbols of a civilization intoxicated by power. Men who became larger than life, because they wanted to replace life under God with glory under themselves. Here's the twist. Maybe the real terror of the Nephilim was not their height. Maybe it was their influence. Because a giant body can crush a city. But a giant ego can corrupt a world. And then, just when you think the flood erased them forever, the Bible drops a chilling phrase, and also afterward. Read that line again. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Afterward? After what? After the unions? After the corruption? Or after the flood itself? That little phrase has haunted readers for centuries. Because if the flood was meant to wipe the world clean, how do echoes of the Nephilim appear again? By the time we reach the book of Numbers, Israel sends spies into Canaan. And when they return, they are terrified. They say they saw men so large, so overwhelming, that they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. And then they used the name again. Nephilim. Now maybe they were exaggerating out of fear. Maybe Nephilim had become a word for giant-like terror. A label for enemies who looked unconquerable. But what if it was more than exaggeration? What if the world after the flood still carried fragments of the old rebellion? Scars that judgment had not completely erased. But what happened next is where the story becomes more than ancient history. It becomes spiritual warfare. Notice something. The Nephilim don't just appear in Scripture as bodies. They appear as fear. When the spies saw the giants in the land, their courage collapsed. Their vision shrank. Their faith withered. That is how darkness often works. Not only by strength, but by intimidation. Not only by violence, but by convincing you the battle is already lost. The people did not say, God is with us. They said, we are grasshoppers. That's the real power of giants. They make covenant people forget who walks with them. And this is the twist. Whether the Nephilim were literal giants, corrupted rulers, or supernatural hybrids, their effect was the same. They magnified human weakness and minimized divine power. They made people feel small. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because every age has its giants. Empires. Idols. Addictions. Systems. Voices. Things that stand in front of you and whisper. You are too small. God is too late. This cannot be overcome. What most people don't realize is that the Nephilim story may not only be about the past. It may be about the pattern. But here is the deeper layer most people never talk about. What if the Nephilim were not just a bizarre race from ancient history, but part of a direct assault on the image of God in mankind? Think about it. In Genesis, humanity is created in God's image. Human beings are meant to reflect heaven on earth. So what would rebellion try to do first? Corrupt the image. Distort the bloodline. Pollute the inheritance. Turn what was sacred into something broken, violent, and proud. And suddenly the Nephilim story stops feeling random. It starts to look strategic. Not chaos for chaos' sake, but war against creation itself. And if that is true, then the flood was not only judgment. It was rescue. Outside the Bible, ancient Jewish writings like 1 Enoch take this mystery even further. There, the story grows darker, rebellious watchers descend, forbidden knowledge spreads, corruption deepens, and giant offspring devour the earth. Now let's be careful. Those writings are not part of the biblical canon for most traditions. They do not carry the same authority as Genesis. But they reveal something important. Ancient people did not read the Nephilim story as harmless poetry. They read it as terror. As cosmic rebellion. As a fracture in the order of creation. That matters. Because sometimes later traditions preserve how an early audience felt the weight of a text. And the weight here is unmistakable. The Nephilim were remembered as a sign that the line between heaven and earth had been violated. Here's the twist, though. Maybe that ancient fascination tells us something else. Humanity has always been drawn to forbidden power. Always tempted by secret knowledge. Then later, when giant clans appear in the land, Anakim, Rephaim, warriors of terrifying size, God does not tell his people to worship power. He tells them to trust him. And eventually, the pattern narrows into one unforgettable scene. A giant armored in bronze. And a shepherd with a stone. David and Goliath is not just a random underdog story. It is part of the same long war. The seed of faith versus the monsters of pride. The humble anointed one versus the towering defiance of the world. That's the twist. The Bible keeps telling the same story. Giants rise. God remains. And the thing that defeats monstrous power is not monstrous power in return. It is surrendered faith. But if the pattern is spiritual, then the final question is no longer, were the Nephilim real? It becomes something far more uncomfortable. Why does this story still grip people thousands of years later? Because deep down, we know the world is still capable of producing things that look impressive, and feel cursed. Power without holiness. Knowledge without wisdom. Fame without truth. Strength without mercy. That is the spirit of the Nephilim story. Something oversized. Something unnatural. Something celebrated by men but offensive to God. And maybe that's why the mystery remains. Because as long as the details stay partly hidden, the warning stays universal. The Nephilim are not only a puzzle to decode. They are a mirror. They force us to ask. What happens when humanity reaches for greatness without God? What happens when the boundaries meant to protect life are treated like obstacles? What happens when renown becomes more important than righteousness? What most people don't realize, is that the story may be mysterious on purpose. Because mystery makes you feel what explanation can't. And this is where the story stops being ancient folklore and becomes a warning to the soul. The Nephilim represent more than physical terror. They represent mixture. Corruption. Boundary-breaking rebellion. The worship of power over obedience. That is why they appear beside judgment. Not because Scripture is obsessed with monsters. But because heaven is deadly serious about what destroys the human soul. There is a reason the world before the flood is described as violent. A reason the promised land is filled with fear. A reason giants keep showing up wherever people forget who God is. Because giant evil is never just out there. It begins the moment the human heart decides it would rather be mighty than holy. And once that happens, civilizations can become enormous. And still be doomed. So who were the Nephilim? Maybe they were literal giants born from an ancient supernatural rebellion. Maybe they were warrior kings, tyrants, men who became legends through violence. Maybe they were both symbol and history, real enough to terrify, mysterious enough to remain partly concealed. But here is the answer Scripture seems most determined to give. The Nephilim were a sign that the world had become deeply, catastrophically disordered. A signal flare before judgment. A monument to corrupted greatness. A reminder that anything built in defiance of God, no matter how mighty, will fall. And maybe the full truth is still hidden for a reason. Because sometimes God gives you enough light to see the warning, but not enough to satisfy the appetite that led people into darkness in the first place. Why does this matter today? Because every person will face giants. Some external. Some buried deep within. Fear. Pride. Temptation. Power. The urge to become impressive instead of faithful. The craving to be known instead of being righteous. The Nephilim story reminds us that the most dangerous thing in the world is not size. It is separation from God disguised as greatness. And the good news, quiet, almost hidden beneath all the thunder, is this. God has never been intimidated by giants. Not before the flood. Not in Canaan. Not on the battlefield. And not in your life. So the next time you read those strange verses in Genesis, don't rush past them. Sit in the mystery. Feel the warning. And remember. Some of the darkest stories in Scripture were not written to feed curiosity, but to wake us up.